Professional opinion, is it fair to say that the conclusions of the National Toxicology Program that there is an association between higher fluoride exposure and lower IQ in children is accurate?
Yes. I would say that, in my view, the evidence is quite persuasive that there is a negative impact of fluoride exposure on the neurodevelopment of children, particularly the research that's been coming out in prenatal exposure.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Derrick Broze to discuss the first day of the fluoride lawsuit, fluoride trial, and what is important thus far. Obviously, that clip that we just opened with is pretty powerful. And surprise, surprise, it's exactly what Derrick's been telling you this entire time about not just the reality of fluoride, but what the report itself has been showing, why they've been dragging their feet. And I mean, as I framed it yesterday in my tweet, is simply that this is your government actively fighting to keep this dangerous stuff in your water, and nobody seems to want to talk about that. So thank God Derrick is down there covering this. Let's get some updates on what's currently going on day one. Derrick, how are you?
I'm doing great, brother. Thanks for having me on. And of course, thanks to everybody at TLAV, all of our audience and supporters for the crowdfunding, because I wouldn't be here without you guys. You helped cover my flight, the hotel I'm in right now, and making sure I can eat while I'm here. So I do appreciate that to everybody who donated.
Yeah, absolutely. You got a big response there, and really, big shout out to all the people that were, that find this to be as important as it is. And I really am shocked, even to this point, how few people seem to care and cover this. I saw you gave a shout out to Kim Iverson, that she was talking with Connett. It's good to see more of this kind of getting through the independent media, but it needs more coverage for sure.
Oh, I wish there was more people here. I mean, I tweeted
Yeah.
this yesterday too, that I think it's a missed opportunity for independent media. Now, I understand everybody can't travel to California, but it is available for on Zoom as well. So people could be doing what I was doing in 2020 and live tweeting as well, or just writing articles and reporting on the facts. I know there's a lot going on right now, especially in the U.S., but as you kind of set the stage, this is a really important historic trial that we've been trying to get more attention on. So I'm happy to be here. Wish there was more people here, and I'm planning to be here for the duration.
Well, good, good. I mean, what's so alarming about this is just how on the surface, like obviously the fluoride part of this is important, right? This is dangerous. It has an impact on IQ, and it's, I think, much bigger than that. But just the fact that this is such a like it's been so clear. The report, the secondary story, maybe even the main story, is that your government is aware of what the report shows. And there's no, as far as I could tell, unless more comes out in this hopefully the culmination of the trial, they're not saying like, here's the alternative. I mean, they're claiming that their alternative studies show that there's not, that they don't find the same thing, but the evidence is clear in this report. And it's interesting that they would take so much effort to stop this from being discussed, seen by it feels very nefarious to me. I know I'm a pessimist when it comes to our government, but man, it feels very obvious this is an attempt to, keep something dangerous in people's water. It just kind of blows my mind. So let's start, from the very beginning. What was your impression of, Dr. Or Judge Chen? I know it's been a little bit back and forth, but do you get the feeling out of the gate that he's engaging with this with an open mind?
I do, and I've said this in the past couple of years that we've been talking about this, that for the most part, Judge Chen, who has been the one overseeing this trial since the beginning, that even back in 2020, he seemed open to listening. He wasn't immediately just shutting down whenever Michael Connett, the lead attorney for the Fluoride Action Network, talks about, for example, the emails that we have that show CDC and HHS, Rachel Levine, intervening to block the National Toxicology Program study. He allowed this time for the second phase of the trial. I guess just for one moment, for those who don't know, this is the second phase of the fluoride lawsuit, fluoride trial, that just resumed yesterday, Wednesday. And this morning, as we're recording this, I'm heading to the courtroom in less than an hour for day two. But in between the two phases, the first phase back in 2020 and this one, the National Toxicology Program was supposed to release what's called a monograph, a review of all the different high quality, low bias studies on water fluoridation, particularly related to its neurotoxin effects. And that report never came out, even though the judge was waiting on it. But we now have emails that show why it didn't come out, because behind the scenes, the US government, as you said, elements of the US government were working to prevent the study from becoming public. Now, because of the work of the Fluoride Action Network and the emails that they were able to force the release of, the National Toxicology Program did release the draft version, but this is still not the final version. Nevertheless, Judge Chin decided in a hearing about a week ago that he would allow the NTP draft to be brought into evidence. So, that was kind of a big question, because he could say, oh, that's just the draft and we still don't have the final version, so it doesn't count. We're not going to look at that. Instead, he said he would give it a fair amount of weight when considering and making his decision. So that's a positive that we started off on. And yesterday was basically, so the trial's going 8:30 a.m. here in California, in San Francisco, to 1:30 with recesses of 15 to 20-minute breaks periodically. But for the most part, it's 8:30 to 1:30 p.m. Every day. And we heard the opening statements from the Fluoride Action Network from Michael Connett, where he basically laid out what they plan to share in the case they're going to make. And then we heard from the U.S. government attorneys, the Department of Justice, the EPA, and their case. And, what you were talking about just a moment ago, Ryan, not only are they claiming that fluoride is actually safe and doesn't cause any harm, they're trying to use a study that claims that fluoride actually increases the IQ of boys, which was just like,
and this really quickly, this is an interesting point that overlaps with the COVID discussion, right? Where it's really about rearranging the data in a certain way. We're like, well, if you omit this and if you frame this the certain way, that, and there's some level of validity to that. There's a point to be made, but it's about the point that this has been 4 years in the making, and the data they're claiming it's been ready for a very long time. So this just feels like an effort to kind of like roll the data out, which is actually called p hacking. There's a term for it, where you just kind of juxtapose it certain way until you get what you want from it, And I think that's pretty clear, in my opinion.
And that term did come up, p-hacking did come up for just a moment in one of the testimonies. Good. I can't recall, but yeah, it was brought up because that was what Michael Connett and the Fluoride Action Network were basically arguing. Is like, look, the government went and hurried up and got a new study so they could bring it here to the trial, and say, hey, look, there's even more current data. Forget that older data from a couple of years ago that they're worried about. Don't worry about the NTP. We've got a new study. And Michael Connett was doing, there's going to be cross-examination when that the lead author of that study, he's the only witness that's not in person. This is another reason why I wanted to be in person. Like you showed my interview with Dr. Howard Hu yesterday. He was here for one day. If I hadn't been here in person, we wouldn't have been able to get that interview and get that important testimony on the record. On the side of the Fluoride Action Network, they're still going to call Dr. Bruce Lamfier and Dr. Granjin, who's from Denmark, and he's one of the lead scientists in the world on lead toxicity. And there's really a lot of crossover that we were hearing yesterday between what took place with lead, and most people realize lead is toxic, of course, and lead, as we've talked about, I think in a recent conversation, that lead is another huge problem. But the difference between the lead problem with the old lead pipes all across the US, which are leaching and harming people, and that is like a major issue that needs to be addressed. But the difference is that fluoride is something that taxpayers are paying to add into the water, as opposed to like old infrastructure that's leaking something. Both are a problem, but fluoride is being added purposefully. But nonetheless, some of the talking points that were being presented yesterday were really drawing comparisons between the problem with lead that people are well aware of and the same issue. In fact, a lot of yesterday, for those who don't know, I am live tweeting, so I will be live tweeting from the courtroom this morning. You can find me on Twitter or X at @DBrozeLiveFree. And I'm basically starting a new thread every time, if when we go to a recess break, I'll start a new one. And a lot of it gets into the weeds, and I'll be honest, I'm doing my best to keep up because I do understand a bit of it. But when I'm sitting there trying to how do I condense that point down to 140 characters or something that's digestible, I do my best. But sometimes you might get lost in the weeds. I just encourage you to stay up because the details are in there, and the important details. And it is the science. This is a battle over science, so it's going to get technical. It's going to get scientific. And again, I do think Judge Chen is doing his honest best effort to try to ask real questions, because I'm sure some of it's going over his head too, and he's doing his best. Like, okay, go back, hold on, I have a question, clarify that for me, and I think that's important. But there's been discussion of lead being brought in. There was discussion yesterday of that. We're going to hear from the Fluoride Action Network about how that IQ study that apparently increased boys' IQ by 28 points. But Michael Connett was already kind of.
You really didn't. That's the study you referenced a moment ago for the audience, that they're claiming that they did their own study, which actually found when they rearranged it that it increased the IQ, which is hilarious when you It's just,
Yeah.
it seems very good.
It's a government study. Well, not a government funded study, but it's the one the government is using in this case. And
Mm.
Michael Conant, he kind of previewed, I guess, his attack on it that we're going to hear in the next couple days or weeks or so, which he was basically just kind of getting into the methodology of how they did it. Like you said, we all know you can use statistics, you can frame it one way. There was a lot of discussion, for example, about the difference between a linear line, a straight line, and then a curved line, which again, some of it went beyond my understanding, but basically what was coming down to is they were showing how like you could craft the data to look one way or the other. You could make it emphasize fluoride's negative impacts, or you
Right.
could change a couple things, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, fluoride increases IQ. And so we're going to get into some of that in the coming days. But the big thing yesterday that I just really want everybody to come away with is we had the opening statements from the Fluoride Action Network, and then we had the opening statements from the government, and that took place. And then Dr. Howard Hu is a very credentialed man, and he was here in person. He's from the University of Southern California, epidemiologist, and a lot of background in different areas. He was here in person and did his testimony. He was questioned by the Fluoride Action Network. He was cross-examined by the government. He was redirected by the Fluoride Action Network, and then one more time by the government. So, he withstood it all, and they were definitely doing their best to pick apart his work. And I honestly think, I will say, there was a couple times where it didn't look great for him, where again, not to get into too much of the weeds, but one of the witnesses that the Fluoride Action Network is going to call is Dr. Granjing that I mentioned from Denmark, who's a really credentialed scientist. And he did a recent study just last year, 2023, and it was Dr. Granjing, Dr. Howard Hu, and some other scientists. And the government, from my assessment, from my point of view, it seemed like they were basically trying to say that they were doing the same thing that the government was doing with that IQ study that increases the IQ. They're like, oh, you guys tried to get all your data together real quick so you could have a study to present to, court here. And Dr. Howard Hood said that the approach they took was a pooled approach. So instead of one scientist in one study working on it, he started to pool his data with other scientists who are also working on it. And one of them happened to be Dr. Granjing. And so they seem to have a cordial, friendly relationship. I mean, I wouldn't put it past the anti-fluoridation activists or scientists who I think are really just following the science. I don't think they're trying to be like, oh, we're going to make fluoride look bad no matter what. But I'm sure over the years they've become friends because there's only so few of them that are on this path and are willing to speak up and to speak out. So I'm sure that there was a little bit of conversation about like, hey guys, look, if we pull our studies together, this is going to be a stronger study. I don't think there's anything illegal or immoral about that, but the government was definitely doing their job to kind of paint doubt in the judge's mind of like, oh, look, you're just trying to bring this data together to make it look better. But actually, if you separate the studies, it's not as strong. And why didn't you include this other study from here in your pooled data? It's just because you guys are cherry picking and trying to pick data that makes your points, and maybe there was some of that, but I do think that doesn't change the fact that the overwhelming data points to fluoride being a neurotoxicant, which is the main focus. I'm sure the folks who are more informed about fluoride understand that fluoride affects the thyroid, it affects the bones, the hips, the kidneys, the liver. Really, none of that is being brought into the trial. Dr. Howard, who did mention the thyroid at one point in relation to the fact that once the thyroid's affected, it will affect mental health as well. But for the most part, the TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act that the EPA is this whole petition and this whole lawsuit's under, specifically deals with toxicants. And the Fluoride Action Network had to narrow down their focus. They couldn't just be super broad about it. So they picked neurotoxin, which is obviously, I think, something most people get. We have data showing lower IQ in children after prenatal exposure, which I just want to emphasize. I mean, fluoride is such a danger to pregnant mothers and to their children. And, at one point they were showing some statistics saying that there's probably 400,000 pregnant mothers at any given time in the US. And those pregnant mothers, their intake of fluoride actually appears, according to some of the graphs and figures they were showing, it appears to increase as you get further along the pregnancy to the third trimester, when the mother's probably drinking more water because the baby's growing and they're needing to consume. But also at the time, and I thought this was really just disturbing, that the baby is of course 100% dependent on the mother to start forming its bones. So the baby's pulling calcium from the mother's body, and it's pulling the fluoride with it because those who have heard that fluoride calcifies the pineal gland and other parts of the body, it basically displaces calcium, and it can lead to these problems with calcium. It displaces the iodine as well. And so it does so many different things to the body that when the pregnant mother is drinking fluoridated water and drinking or eating processed foods that also contain fluoridated water and being exposed to pesticides that contain fluoride in them, and then she's getting further along the pregnancy and the baby's growing and the baby's pulling resources from the mom even more so it can start to form its skeletal structure and be ready to come out, it's absorbing all that fluoride. It is absorbing it at such a high intake. If the mother is, of course, and we all know that everything the mom eats is going to come straight into
Right.
the baby, and it's really just taking this beautiful process of a mom creating a life and starting it out on the very wrong foot and a very dangerous foot. So to hear that being outlined by Dr. Howard, who was just something I've been aware of, but just for them to really put it in terms of like, by the time you get to the third trimester, the baby is getting these high levels of fluoride. And that is where we're seeing these lower IQs and the as they get older, as they progress.
Yeah. Well, so this, I think that this, for the average person, will have a lot more weight. Like most people will tend to look at the culmination of the trial rather than the statements made throughout it. But nonetheless, I think the important point here is that the body of evidence, the same thing that would be shoved down our throats in any other circumstance if it was reversed, is pretty obviously pointing in the direction that there is an issue with fluoride, right? Like the peer-reviewed science is pretty damn obvious. You can find evidence across the board. So what's crazy to me is that the allegation of cherry picking is applied when they're pooling multiple studies and data points versus their quick thrown, with even just not even trying to, I do think they threw it together, but just the one study, it just seems very disingenuous, So is there any indication? Well, it's early, it's hard to say, but I mean, I guess we'll have to wait to end to see where Judge Chen is really leaning. But I guess there's a couple of points that I wanted to get into in regard to the tweets that you had put out and like back and forth on this. That at one point I found interesting in regard to the studies itself is that they were arguing, let me know where this ended up or if it's even been decided, that only pushing for only US studies to be used, which just seems pretty manipulative in my opinion. But do you have any thoughts on that, and where did that end up?
Yeah, so the government did try to argue that at one point, or at least bring that up to the fact and tried to say like, look, I think it was during the cross-examination of Doctor Who where they were trying to, again, the whole goal here is to plant doubt in the judge's mind. And so they try to make the witness look as just, as uncredible as possible and not worth listening to. And so, there was some questions about there's been a few studies they're referring to. One's a Canadian study, one is a Mexico study, and then there's a Spanish study. The Spanish study is the one that apparently, the high IQ is from fluoride. That this doctor, and actually in my last article for the Last American Vagabond, people can find on our fluoride page, which I wrote on Monday right before this started. I referenced that doctor, and I'll talk about him in just a moment. But so there's these different studies, and there's only been one more recent one that Dr. Howard Hu was involved in that did involve mainly Hispanic, Latino pregnant mothers in Los Angeles County. And so the government was trying to say, well, what's the point of referencing these data if we're, this lawsuit has to do with U.S. Exposure and through water fluoridation, not through all these other sources. So they don't want the judge to listen to the fact, which is a fact, that we're all being exposed to fluoride more than just the water we drink and the water we shower in, and that it's all these other sources, and that adds up to a cumulative effect that goes even beyond the level that they're saying is safe. So there's that, but it's also that the government, I guess their goal was to try to get the judge to think there's no weight to these studies. We really shouldn't listen to them. And the interesting thing is that's the first time they've said this in the whole trial. So back in 2020, they never started out by saying, hey, judge, we shouldn't listen to these studies. They're not based in the U.S. If that was their argument, they probably should have started that from the beginning. It seems like, in my view, they're probably getting desperate and they're looking for any way to poke holes in that. Now, that wasn't, I think the judge either, overruled their objection or just kind of ignored it and moved on and said, like, here we are, because the studies are still being considered. They haven't been thrown out of court or anything like that.
Good. Well, I mean, the concentration point is obviously, paramount as far as I'm concerned. I mean, this is the obvious reality, because if you just want to take the one, just take the water from the tap and only include in like one engagement and argue that this is a certain level, it's just not accurate. You're drinking water, you're taking showers, you're eating food that takes in water, cooking pasta, whatever it is, there is an overlap there. So that's it. I think you're right. I think it shows that they're very aware that if this is framed the right way, that they're going to lose. I mean, that's what lawyers do. So they're trying to, compile this in a way that looks as, the opposite. Well, as I was showing this, it reminds me of the other point in this, that there was an example in this where they were talking about this exact point, right? In regard to removing the negative conclusions. And didn't that already come up as well, where he essentially had to admit that that did happen? That was in the email, where it's delete or remove this at the end or something like that. Go ahead.
I don't think that guy has is going to be brought into court. The one that we were just showing, the California State Dental Director, but I do believe the Fluoride Action Network is going to bring that up. They have been kind of hinting at these emails. I will say, and I wrote this in my last article, that one of the things, the judge did say, yeah, we will give the fair amount of weight to the NTP draft report, but he said that he's not really interested in hearing about the political suppression angle. He just wants to focus on the science, which I think is like, okay, maybe that's his role of trying to just be super neutral. But I also think it's important, and I'm hoping that Michael Connett still finds a way to bring that and put it on the record, because it needs to be on the record. And that's, for those who don't understand, we can have conversations all day on the internet about like, oh, they're suppressing fluoride studies, but getting it in the record of a federal court where it's going to be saved and people can download this and look at it for years to come, it's going to be important, because if the trial doesn't go in the favor of banning water fluoridation, what happens in this court is going to become sort of, I think, like one of these legendary conspiracy theories. Oh, did you know one time it went to the federal court and there were scientists saying this? We need it on the record at the very least for future potential litigation or journalism in general. And I just want to make a couple more points before I get out of here and get ready to go over there. One thing was on that study of the IQ increase. As I wrote in the last article that I put up on Monday, the guy's name is, I don't want to mispronounce it, is Ibarliza or something like that. It was the Spanish study that I mentioned, Dr. Jesus Ibarluizia. And he's the one that claimed that fluoride increased the IQ in boys. But the Fluoride Action Network, they have obtained information via some emails that they got via FOIA. They've been doing a great job of getting these emails out. That basically that doctor lied under oath. So I'm assuming that when the government brings up his study and says, here's this wonderful study and it shows all the benefits of fluoride, that Fluoride Action Network is going to pull out these emails and say, hey, look, we've obtained emails that show when he was asked during his deposition, this Jesus Ibarluizia, he was asked by the Fluoride Action Network when he was under oath if he had ever been asked to delete information regarding his fluoride study. He said, never, 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 ever. That was his exact quote. But then they get an email via FOIA, and it shows that there's an email between him and the CDC's Division of Oral Health about his study, and the entire email is redacted except for the last line that says, please delete this message. And the rest of the email had been redacted by the CDC. So I don't know what that was all about, but I imagine we're going to hear more about that. And again, their goal from the Fluoride Action Network side will be to make that doctor look uncredible and like, hey, Judge, we can't rely on this study. And then the other point I want to make, the last point really, is that the government is trying to argue that, okay, we have some studies that show lower IQ in children, but those studies aren't credible for this or that reason, right? And even if they are credible, they're at, this level of, there's this metric that right now I think the government recommends 0.7 milligrams per liter of fluoride, and most cities are at that or even a little below it, maybe a few above it. But they're finding harm even below that level, right? And what they've been arguing is like, look, even if the harm is not at the exact level that you're recommending, with all other considerations of toxins, including with the TSCA previous, like Michael Connett's showing previous EPA evaluations of toxins and showing they never looked for like, oh, it has to be over and above and beyond the level. They just look for like, is it causing harm at a certain level? And then there's something from what I gathered that he said you have to sort of judge it by like this 10 times impact. So even if it's at this level, you have to look at of tenfold beyond that, because if you're going to try, the goal was to try to protect the most vulnerable populations, right? So maybe it's affecting most average people at this level, and you're like, well, we're at this level and it's safe, so who cares? It's below that. But you have to bring into consideration the most vulnerable populations, people with low, immune systems, or just all kinds of things that might make them more susceptible to harm already. And if you're going to practice the principle of, just like the principle of looking for the most vulnerable population and trying to preempt that harm, which is what TSCA was set up to do in the first place. That's what the whole thing, that law is all about. Then fluoride should be banned. Like that's basically what they've been arguing. Of course, the government's going to try to argue against that. But I thought that was an important point, that even if you don't consider these studies quality, which it appears they are, that are showing harms at these different levels, we know harm does exist, and the government even admits that. They're not, trying to lie and say like, no, there's no harm at all. They're just saying, yeah, okay, there's some harm, but it's at this level. And then they're trying to argue. And then if you go beyond that, it actually disappears. So they're claiming that no harm, lots of harm, and then all of a sudden, if you keep going, the harm disappears, which doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I thought that was an important point, that Michael Connett was trying to make the point, like, look, we need to protect the most vulnerable. So even if you don't think it's harming the entire population, we know there's harm that does exist, and thus the EPA should rule, or the judge should rule, that the EPA needs to ban it under the TSCA.
Yeah. Well, one thing that popped into my head here is, is there any engagement at all with the benefit or the lack thereof? Because I find that an interesting point in all this is a hyper focus, rightly so, on whether this is damaging. But I think it's an important aspect of this to prove that their benefit is part of the lie here. I don't see any real benefit. I mean, if they want to push the idea that it somehow helps your teeth, that's already been ridiculously shown to be false, especially at the higher levels. So what is the arguable benefit? What, even if you argue there's not if there's any negative and there's zero benefit, then I think that already throws it out, right? I mean, is there any engagement with that side of the conversation?
There hasn't been yet, but I'm sure we're going to get into that. And yeah, I tend to believe, and I've done research, I've written articles probably a decade ago of studies showing that fluoride doesn't actually reduce cavities that we're still being told. And if, for folks who do watch my interview with Dr. Howard, who I think is a brilliant man, he seems to be just kind of waking up to the fact that government is corrupt and science can be corrupted, because again, most scientists, I think, are in such a bubble. They just are so singularly focused on what they study. And he admits, he's like, well, 10 years ago, I didn't think fluoride was worth looking into. I kind of was dismissive of it until I started to look deeper, right? So he also still holds the belief, as he says in my interview, that fluoride is good for your teeth. And we all know that it's all good. It's like, I didn't even want to go down that road with him because he had short time, but I don't believe that's accurate. I mean, maybe you could look at some data and there's something to that, but overall, we're dealing with a product of phosphate mining, a toxin that has been shown in all its forms, even the naturally occurring fluoride that does appear in some people's water around the world, is harmful. There's no benefit to putting this in our bodies. And I would say, yeah, I guess if you want to buy fluoridated toothpaste, you should have that right to do so. I'm not trying to take that away from you, but there's no reason at all to put it in the water and to imagine that that's doing good for our teeth or our bodies. So yeah. And as I said, I'm about to head over to the courts about 5 minutes from here, and we're going to start with day 2. I think that this will be the Fluoride Action Network bringing their next witnesses, either Dr. Bruce Lamphere or Dr. Philip Grandjean. And I'll be live tweeting all day today, folks, and we'll be doing more of these interviews.
Outstanding. Well, and lastly, just so you guys know, in general, remember, as he was saying, this can be, really in depth, and there's a lot going on, and, to follow it all. But Derrick will be following up with some reports on the Last American Vagabond and his own as well. So make sure you keep an eye out for that, so you can kind of get caught up on all where this goes. So, last thing out the door, Derrick, what do you feel right now about this? You having a good sense about where this is going? Are you feeling positive or negative about what's been happening so far?
I mean, day 1 felt fairly positive. And again, like, I think that for me, this is an important experience because I enjoy covering trials. I've covered them before, and it's a very particular kind of work where you just got to like listen and type and just be on your toes and everything. And I enjoy that exercise. But also on the personal level, fluoride is one of the first things that I woke up to in 2010. It was one of the first things, a bit of activism I ever did, was start putting up flyers around my neighborhood about there's poison in the tap water. And, so to come from that to now be here as a journalist, documenting this, talking to the scientists, it's kind of in some ways it is a bittersweet moment. I do think this is going to go our way. I'm hoping and I'm praying that actual justice does come out on top here. And I just hope all those people who told me I was crazy in the past are aware of this trial and know that the science is here. It's right in front of us. All you got to do is look.
Exactly. And if anyone wants to continue to support this, he's going to be there all week. We'll include this link as well for you to support covering the culmination of the trial. Derrick, you're doing excellent work there. Thank you for what you're doing. And then we'll touch base soon. So anybody out there, as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.